topics and opinions expressed in the following show are solely those of the hosts and their guests and not those of W4CY Radio, its employees, or affiliates. We make no recommendations or endorsements for radio show programs, services, or products mentioned on air or on our web. No liability, explicit or implied, shall be extended to W4CY Radio or its employees or affiliates. Any questions or comments should be directed to those show hosts. Thank you for choosing W4CY Radio.
What's working on purpose anyway? Each week, we ponder the answer to this question. People ache for meaning and purpose at work, to contribute their talents passionately and know their lives really matter. They crave being part of an organization that inspires them and helps them grow into realizing their highest potential. Business can be such a force for good in the world, elevating humanity. In our program, we provide guidance and inspiration to help usher in this world we all want, working on purpose. Now, here's your host, Dr. Elise Cortez.
Welcome back to the Working on Purpose program, which has been brought to you with passion and pride since February of 2015. Thanks for tuning in this week. Great to have you. I'm your host, Dr. Elise Cortez. If we've not met before and you don't know me, I am a workforce advisor, organizational psychologist, management consultant, logotherapist, speaker, and author. My team and I at Gusto now help companies to enliven and fortify their operations by building a dynamic, high-performance culture, inspirational leadership, and nurturing managers activated by meaning and purpose. And did you know that inspired employees outperform their satisfied peers by a factor of 2.25 to 1? In other words, inspiration is good for the bottom line. You can learn more about us and how we can work together at gusto-now.com or my personal site, elisecortez.com. Getting into today's program, we have with us Melissa Swift. She's the founder of Anthrome Insight, an innovative organizational consultancy, and her long and distinguished career has included leadership roles at Korn Ferry, Capgemini, Mercer, and Deloitte. Over the years, she has developed novel and market-leading analytical techniques to better understand and address the human side of organizations. She has led large-scale people transformation work across industries, ranging from life sciences to aerospace to professional services. She is the author of Work Here Now, Think Like a Human and Build a Powerhouse Workplace. Today, we will be talking about that book. She joins us from New York City. Melissa, a hearty welcome to Working on Purpose.
Thank you for having me. The whole thematic behind this podcast really resonates. So I am just super excited to be having this conversation.
Delighted, right? You and I think we might be able to occasionally finish the sentences, maybe using different vocabulary. Yes. Well, let's just start with, as I was saying before we got on air, you're clearly a very busy woman, gallivanting about the planet with lots of things going on. You have a family, a very, very big career, and now we're out writing books. So why did you write this one?
Yeah, so it's interesting. Work Here Now was born as a very different book in my mind. That part of what I originally got interested in was just, we do some stuff at work that I think is kind of kooky and strange. Everything from, agile rituals to hot desking. We do a lot of things that have a tiny flavor of the absurd. And so the book started off as this kind of, carnival funhouse tour through the world of work. And then COVID hit. And it suddenly just became so absurdly clear to me as I'm, trying to work and lead a practice at Korn Ferry and, teach my daughter virtual kindergarten. It was one of those moments where the water got all pulled out of the lagoon and you could really see the rocks. And that's sort of where what Work Here Now became, that's where it was born, is this idea of, can we really put language against what's wrong with work? And then let's, what would we do differently if we could name some of the problems in really clear and explicit ways? And that kind of became my mission.
Mm-hmm. Well, I really appreciate that on a number of levels, in part because the work that I do helping develop organizations and leaders, of course, starts with, as you're saying, getting clear and making it conscious just what's going on here and how people are feeling, how you, the leader, is feeling, how you're relating to your people in the organization. If you don't have one consciousness about that and language to use around it, it's really hard to start to address it. So I really like how you have put words, very, very interesting, I would say creative words, to why these problems exist. So what I would like to do, Melissa, for this conversation, for the benefit of our listeners and viewers around the world who are listening, is I want to just take and kind of jump into each one of your chapters. We won't get to all of them, and just situate a bit about what it is you're trying to put forth as to what's problematic there. And then I want to just offer, because you offer 90 strategies in the book on an organizational or team level to start to address this stuff. So for each of these sort of issues, we'll talk about a couple of strategies that the listeners and viewers can start to use to address that. So as they recognize, yep, we got that problem, then we're going to immediately give them at least a couple strategies that they can start to take back home and put to work. So let's dive in. You ready?
I'm ready. This sounds
Okay,
great.
well, chapter 1, let's just, the great work unpack, understanding and fixing broken work. Yeah, it really is, right? I mean, and first let me situate for you, Melissa. I am an organizational psychologist and do the work that I do because I believe in the wonder and power of work. And it needs to be a more fluid, workable part of our lives. And it just isn't for so many people, as you so eloquently point out. So let's talk about just a couple of things that are related to that first idea of, maybe if we make the everyday experience of work suck less, maybe we would actually get more done. What a concept.
Well, it's funny though, because we do a lot to avoid talking about the everyday experience of work. This is one of the things that's really fascinated me in my career, and you probably see manifestations of this in your work with leaders, I would guess, is that we will systematize and frameworkize and do anything to kind of talk around what are people's working days like day to day, and just treating kind of that everyday average experience of work as a data point, right? Not getting weird about it, not getting emotional about it, not saying it has to be what it has to be because this is the ROI we need and this is what the stakeholders need. Just taking a step back and saying, okay, this is what people's working days are like. Are these all choices we would make? To your point about consciousness, right? Would we choose to set work up this way? And in general, we absolutely would not. And by the way, the shareholders wouldn't want us to either, right? It's not a win for individuals. It's not a win for the organization. It's not a win for anybody. But it requires that moment of you have to kind of almost like look right into the eyes of what people do all day long. And that's a journey.
It really is. And I love how you just brought that down to just like, let's just talk about what we're actually doing here. So let's talk about this. So if work isn't working and it sucks for a lot of people, let's talk about a couple strategies that you offer in the book. Just one of them is you talk about the need and the opportunity to regularly re-examine work for signs of being dangerous, dull and annoying, frustrating and confusing. Wow, if we were to alleviate those kinds of things, man, we would turn the world upside down right there.
Absolutely. And again, just treating them as data, right? I've seen so many leaders, and again, I'm sure you have seen this too, where people are whiny and people are complaining. Well, no, when they talk about being bored, when they talk about being frustrated, that's work going wrong, right? That is not helping your profitability as an organization. And they're actually trying to tell you that. They're giving you helpful data and you're disregarding it. The same with work being dangerous. You look at those wonderful visualizations of what your brain looks like when you're on Zoom calls back to back all day, right? You can actually see people's brains kind of subtly on fire. You look at that and it's like, well, people need to just tough it out. Well, no, that's not somebody at peak performance at that point. So it's like just correct for those things that workers experience as problematic. And actually the whole operational machine runs better at that point. But you have to, again, kind of get past that psychological hurdle from they're whining to they're giving me neutral data and I can choose what to do with it.
Yes, beautifully explained. Okay, another strategy that I'd like to offer for this just idea of work sucking as it does for many people. One of your other strategies is don't take intensified work for granted and don't be afraid to de-intensify. So first we've got to situate what you mean by intensified work.
So intensified work is one of the most interesting concepts from the academic world that we don't talk about enough in professional practice. So I went down kind of a rabbit hole in academic studies of work, just trying to figure out why. I'm Gen X, and I feel like work has gotten harder in my lifetime, right? Like I have watched something happen, and it's not just that like I'm old and curmudgeonly. Honestly, I was a curmudgeon at age 22, right? Like the curmudgeon is a constant across my life. But something has gone a bit weird. And it turns out that academics actually study this notion of work intensification. And it's got three aspects to it. Number one is too many tasks in too little time. Number two is excess interdependence. I love this one because
Mm.
any large complex organization, which is what all my clients have been like over the years, right? This business of I rely on this process and this process and this person, it wears people down. It's what you saw Jamie Dimon very upset about, the 17 committees, right? He's complaining about interdependence. And then the third one is just excess emotion in the workplace. So that could be you're a customer service rep who gets yelled at, or that could just be your boss yelling at you.
Yeah.
But all of those things, I in the book that I'm working on now, I analogize it to, it's like carrying a bag of sponges versus carrying a bag of bricks. The sponges might be the same size as the bricks, but the bricks are so much denser and they weigh you down more. So that's why if you have an intensified workday, either too many tasks, too much interdependence, or too much emotion, that same 10 hours, 8 hours of work feels a lot heavier than it did before. And again, we say, well, just work is work and you got to grind. And no, if we've just convinced ourselves that we can do more tasks than we can actually do, that's just us doing it wrong. It doesn't have to be that way. And you can fix it. And you can fix it within your own working team. And I think that's where some of the power lies in recognizing work intensification. Is you may not be empowered to fix it across your whole organization, but oftentimes you can kind of get some stuff done sort of local to yourself.
I got to believe right about now, Melissa, just there's a few people listening in that are going, oh my gosh, there's hope. She's helped me understand and put words and language to just what's happening around her. And even just that simple thing of, wait, what do you mean? People don't actually have to scream at you at work? That I don't actually have to experience that? I'm sure that people are listening to that going, wow, what a different day that would be.
Yeah, well, absolutely, because we do a lot of myth making. We have these myths of like the screaming, passionate boss, right? Get it done. And it's just a myth, right?
Right.
You don't have to believe in the Easter Bunny. You don't have to believe in Santa Claus, and you don't have to believe that style of leadership is the most impactful and effective. And folks like you and I who work with a wide array of leaders often see leaders who are wildly different from that mold and incredibly effective. Who can be either quiet and introverted or very extroverted, but they don't have that sort of like yelling negative emotion thing going on. And it's unbelievable what they can accomplish.
Oh, yes. I encourage that kind of behavior right and left. Okay. So your language in the book is so fun, Melissa. I knew you were going to be great gobs of fun to talk with because your language choices already are so fun. So part of what you talk about in another chapter is why don't we just get better at digging into the experience of work and fixing it? And then you talk about two monsters that are menacing the world of work. Let's talk about those two monsters.
Yeah. So the first one, we've got the work anxiety monster. And this is the little voice in your head that says either people are lazy and people are slow, or you're lazy and you're slow. And don't underestimate the impact of these anxious thoughts. I mean, my God, I wrote about the anxiety monster. I think about it and I still hit myself with those own thoughts and I have to correct for them on a day-to-day basis, right? So there is something about those anxious thoughts that drive a lot of really bad decisions at team level, at workforce level. Every time you assume that people are too slow and too lazy, you manage them in ways that, again, a ton of research shows us are actually not constructive or helpful. If you harken back to the theory X and theory Y management of the 60s, right? This is integrally related to that. Either you believe people will do the right thing properly empowered, or you don't. I believe people will do the right thing properly empowered. And I think a lot of the research is on my side too. But to do that, you got to make the anxiety monster shut up.
Well, and so to that end, one of your strategies is simply to unpack your foundational talent management assumptions and what decisions are you making on the basis of believing that people are lazy or slow. So this is where it gets really interesting in both of our works. I have to imagine I will go into an organization and start to help organizations. I mirror back the language they're using, and so they can actually hear, oh, they are telling people that they're lazy and slow, or whatever it might be, or there's a punitive relationship between the boss and the employee, the parent and the child, kind of thing. They're not at all aware of. So I think this idea, how even the word using unpack is really important because it still speaks to, they got to get conscious to it, and they got to understand how it's deriving their communication and their behavior. So I think that strategy is really, really powerful. Hard to do without some help, probably from a third party or somebody else.
Yeah, well, because part of the issue here again is, to your point, unconscious choices that, if organizations knew, for instance, they were treating their employees like errant children, many of them, not all of them, but many of them wouldn't do it. But that moment of the aha moment where somebody reflects back to you, this is what you're actually communicating, and this is what your choices and your decisions say. That it just sort of a simple example. If you don't complete your training hours, we're going to dock your pay.
Right.
That's a classic one. I've seen that a lot of places. What that implicitly says is, I don't believe you are intrinsically motivated to learn. I believe you have zero intrinsic motivation to learn. Now, if you sat down the CEOs of most of those companies and said, do you believe your people have zero intrinsic motivation to learn? They'd be like, no, I got all these bright people. I really, they would express constructive, positive sentiments. But the policy doesn't say that. The policy communicates something else. And that's the journey that, you're taking organizations on. And a lot of us are trying to be that helpful mirror to say, this is what you really communicated. You probably didn't mean it, but this is what you said.
Yeah. And I think I see a lot of organizations that are using very, very, very outdated, archaic language like that isn't suitable for today's times, for how people want to be treated. They want to be treated with respect, with appreciation, with dignity. And that sounds very, very punitive and dictatorial. And so it's that kind of language that we have to start to learn how to ferret out of organizations that aligns with your strategies as well. Okay, so we have to talk about the other monster. Again, really fun language here. The other monster that's present in organizations that we need to address is the boss baby customer.
Yeah, so this is a fun one for me because it's a great example of something not so hot coming out of a really good, well-intentioned place. So, some years ago, organizations kind of got hip to this notion of customer centricity, right? We're going to really think about our customer as a person and center a lot of stuff on them. And up to a certain point, bravo, that is fantastic. And I would not argue with thinking that way. But what happens is there's always, as in many of these things, this tendency to over-rotate. And eventually you're treating your consumer like, they're a baby, but they're also in charge of every single thing you do. And what happens when you establish that dynamic is you end up putting kind of unbearable pressure on your human workers. Yeah. So, if you say, okay, we can ship in X amount of time and it's not actually feasible, right? But you're making that boss baby assumption of well, they can't live without it for more than X amount of time. You end up with failures because you promised something that wasn't humanly doable. So you end up disappointing your customer anyway. But B, what you've done to your employees, right, is you've made your customer into a monster for them. And it's not actually what you'd want. Really good customer centricity. You'd want your employees and your customer to actually have this kind of symbiotic, empathic relationship where each group understands the other and they interact in really positive ways that kind of generate a lot of value for both. But you've taken what could be a virtuous circle and really turned it into a vicious cycle.
Mm-hmm. And I appreciate, just to call that out for our listeners and viewers who haven't yet read the book as I have, that one of your strategies is to actually map out how your customer experience and your employee experience interact. And each time you change your customer experience, how is an employee experience impacted? I think that's really important to see. So I will comment more on that and when we come back from our break, but let's grab our first break. I'm your host, Dr. Elise Cortez. We've been on the air with Melissa Swift. She's the founder of Anthrome Insight, an innovative organizational consultancy helping organizations address the human side of organizations. We've been talking about a few of the issues that are really pertinent and invading organizations today. After the break, we're going to talk about one of the next ones, which is what she calls the organizational copy machine. We'll be right back.
Dr. Elise Cortez is a management consultant specializing in meaning and purpose, an inspirational speaker and author. She helps companies visioneer for greater purpose among stakeholders and develop purpose-inspired leadership and meaning-infused cultures that elevate fulfillment, performance, and commitment within the workforce. To learn more or to invite Elise to speak to your organization, please visit her at elisecortez.com. Let's talk about how to get your employees working on purpose. This is Working on Purpose with Dr. Elise Cortez. To reach our program today or to open a conversation with Elise, send an email to Elise, A-L-I-S-E, at elisecortez.com. Now, back to Working on Purpose.
Thanks for staying with us and welcome back to Working on Purpose. I'm your host, Dr. Elise Cortez, as I am dedicated to helping create a world where organizations thrive because their people thrive. They're led by inspirational leaders that help them find and contribute their greatness, and we do business that betters the world. I keep researching and writing my own books. So one of my latest came out. It's called The Great Revitalization: How Activating Meaning and Purpose Can Radically Enliven Your Business. And I really wrote that to help leaders understand today's very diverse and discerning workforce at a different sort of take that Melissa has done. And then I provide 22 best practices that you can use to equip and embed them into your culture to provide that for them. You can find my books on Amazon or my personal site, elisecortez.com. If you are just now joining us, my guest is Melissa Swift. She's the author of Work Here Now, Think Like a Human and Build a Powerhouse Workplace. So before we get into one of the other issues that you've outlined in the book, I did want to comment on this notion of customer service and the notion of really creating a spiral around that with the employee experience. The other extreme of that I think is also maybe equally present is just a complete lack of customer service. I'm amazed how many organizations make it impossible for you to contact anybody anywhere in an organization to talk about a missed service, a missed deadline, a missed product. It's amazing to me. So lots of room for improvement here. Yes, Melissa?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting because it's a version of the same thing we've been talking about in a weird way. It's just there's I think just a bad business myth about the less we see people as people, like the more money we will make. I'm putting it in very stark terms. But what you're describing because I had one of those experiences today. Speak to a human. No, speak to a human. Right. And unfortunately, I think chatbot technology is making what you've described a lot worse. So we have the problem of kind of tech now layering on. But at the root, it's the same idea. It's, if we kind of fail to think about people as people, that's where we make business progress. And I don't buy it.
I don't either. Well, I'm choosing increasingly to move away from the organizations that I can't actually connect with. And I don't feel, the heartbeat of. Voting with the wallet, as we like to say.
Love that.
So I think this next idea here that you have in your book is really, really, really powerful. We want to bring this to life and help our listeners and viewers understand it. And that's this notion of the organizational copy machine. Let's talk about what that really means.
Yeah, so this is interesting. So the deep roots of this idea actually, it came from, I wrote my college thesis, my senior thesis on Dracula and using some of Freud's ideas to analyze Dracula and Isak Dinesian's 7 Gothic Tales. And, one of the big Freudian ideas is this repetition compulsion, right? Like we just can't stop doing the same stuff over and over. And it's a big, obviously you're incredibly familiar with it, right? Because in therapeutic practice, right, there's a lot of focus on just pattern breaking, like stop doing the same silly thing over and over. So just like individuals do the same silly thing over and over, or families do the same silly thing over and over, organizations do the same silly thing over and over. And that's the organizational copy machine that, left to our own devices in groups, just as individuals we will just copy paste the past right into the future. Over and over and over and over. And that's, I think, sometimes the frustration I hear from, practitioners that work on organizational culture is like, oh my goodness, we just have to stop doing the same silly things over and over. And I think that's why this idea of the organizational copy machine is really powerful, because again, if you can name the patterns, and to your point earlier, sometimes you need an external party to say, look, when you did this, it was just like this, it was just like that, and it was just like that. Name the patterns and you have a chance of breaking the patterns. But I think until we really confront the fact that organizations will just neurotically repeat and repeat and repeat, we're going to be kind of constantly unpleasantly surprised by things that should not be surprising.
Indeed. So let's share a few of the strategies you offer in the book. The first one I think is really quite interesting that I wanted to talk about. So listeners and viewers, just so you know, what she's done in the book is for each of these issues that she set about, she then offers 5 organizational strategies and then 5 team strategies. And so I'm just focusing on the conversation for organizational for this for now. But the idea of creating a single account of truth on the workforce of your organization, however you employ them, and systems and processes to maintain it in real time, that's a really interesting idea. What would that look like, maintaining a single account of truth?
Well, it starts from extremely basic basics. I mean, I will never forget the time I was in a conversation. You're talking to clients, sophisticated human capital analytics. And a fairly senior executive leans across the table and goes, Melissa, I couldn't tell you how many employees we have. And I'm like,
Wow.
oh, how funny. And he's like, no, I can't give you a number. I don't have that number accurate. And for me, that was a little bit of a wake up call about how we, in some ways, need to rebuild the foundations of how we think about workforces, and really say, okay, right, this is our FTE group, right? Usually you got to have a good count on those. But all those contractors, you don't employ them through HR, you employ them through procurement. You may not even know how many of them there are. Like maybe you're counting badges, maybe you're not. And then as the types of work get more varied and diverse, which is in general a positive trend, right? Like you want gig workers and task workers, and it's a good thing that the ways you can engage with the workforce become more varied. I'm actually hearing a lot right now about making the retirement cliff less steep, which I think is a fabulous idea, right?
Completely.
Like, why do we chuck all of that institutional knowledge out the door all in one swoop? Like, it's silly. So in general, it's fantastic that we can employ people in a lot more different ways and modes. But if you don't, again, how can you manage your workforce if you don't quite know how many of them there are, if you don't know, exactly how you pay them, right? Because again, if you got this whole group you're paying through procurement, you may be paying them way more per hour for the same work or way less per, doing some of this basic math and then actually getting into some analytics on what are you paying people for. So there was a wonderful study by some former Mercer coworkers of mine where they looked at organizations' stated strategies about what they compensated for versus what actually came out in their pay data. So all these organizations, we pay for performance. Nope, you pay for tenure. People just have to stick around. That's what your data shows. And so you start to look at things like that, and that's where a single account of the truth is really important. Who do you employ? How do you pay them? What do you pay them for? What, again, back to the day-to-day, what work are they doing? Some of these basics, I think that's part of what actually, again, gets people working together really constructively, is that you may be treating people in kind of dramatically inequitable ways, again, completely unintentionally, but also sort of, leveraging human talent in ways that's super inefficient. You might be paying contractors to do really, sort of advanced vanguardish work that you should have FTEs doing, or vice versa. Or you might be automating things that humans should still be doing, not automating things that you should be automating, et cetera, et cetera. But if you don't have that single account of the truth about what is the work, who does it, how do they get paid, et cetera, you'll never know.
Yes, indeed. And I can imagine there's a few people that are listening to this right now going, oh my gosh, that's me. I don't know. So that one of the other strategies, which we sort of alluded to in the last bit that we were talking about here, that you have here related to the organizational copy machine, is just maintaining and periodically energizing the organization and the conversation about how work actually gets done. And this is something that I can say, even in my little small consultancy, we are constantly looking at how to revise how we can do our work more effectively and efficiently, just because we have technology that is showing up in different ways. And so being able to look at how is work getting done on a pretty regular periodic basis, I think that's a really powerful strategy that you offer.
Yeah, and I think your point about technology is a great one, because it's sort of like there's never been a better time to be constantly reevaluating. Because if you think about some of those technologies, like I think of, honestly, ChatGPT as one of my coworkers in my little entrepreneurial business. I think about Copilot as a different, less clever coworker, right? But Copilot is really good at certain things, and ChatGPT is, but those underlying technologies change all the time. So to your point, even with my non-human coworkers, I'm constantly rethinking how the work gets done. But I think, in the current moment, there has never been a better time to do that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and one of the other strategies you talk about, when there are many others as well, but I think this one is really important to talk about here. And I want to help more and more companies do this, and I imagine you do too. And that is to reinvent HR on your organization's terms. And so I know that we have a tendency, and it's just back to the organizational copy machine. We are using policies back from the 1950s, still 60s and 70s. It is insane. So let's talk a little bit about what would that look like to reinvent HR.
Well, I think some of it is being honest about what are your true HR needs as an organization. Because there are all kinds of sort of fads, agile talent pools in HR and, the three-legged stool and all these different constructs and different pieces of them may or may not be, terrific for your organization. But rarely does an organization really take a step back and say, okay, this is the general HR template, but what do we need? What is the ache here,
Yeah,
right? Like,
yeah.
forget kind of checking all these compliance boxes. What is super painful? And, and it might lead you in a different direction than you think. So for instance, you could say the ache, honestly, oh my God, it's employee relations, right? We have a zillion employee relations complaints. That's a mess. Well, is that a function of funky leader behavior, perhaps? Because that might lead you in a completely different direction where you really staff up with HR BPs who are high powered and can face off against your executives and create cultural change that then solves for what looks like a big transactional ER problem. But I think you have to kind of go into it with your detective hat on a bit. And that's, again, you could slavishly adopt all these different trends and you could augment your tech stack. I mean, there's been so much focus on HR tech, and tech's not really the issue. It's what's the model, and does the model serve your actual strategic objectives? And does the model, are you actually kind of caring for the human beings in your organization? I mean, you wouldn't treat the organization's external image this way in the marketing department. You wouldn't treat its money this way in the finance department, right? So don't treat your humans that way in the HR department.
Well said, Melissa, and just so simply stated. And like, yes, what's the ache? I really applaud that and appreciate that. Grabbing our last break, I'm your host, Dr. Elise Cortez. We've been on the air with Melissa Swift. She's the founder of Anthrome Insight, an innovative organizational consultancy, helping organizations to address the human side of organizations. We've been talking about a few opportunities here to really change and elevate your game as an organization, including really looking at how you've got an organizational copy machine that's running your organization. After the break, we're going to talk about one of the other opportunities to look at your decisions about people and really make them addressed for your people. We'll be right back.
Dr. Elise Cortez is a management consultant specializing in meaning and purpose, an inspirational speaker and author. She helps companies visioneer for greater purpose among stakeholders and develop purpose-inspired leadership and meaning-infused cultures that elevate fulfillment, performance, and commitment within the workforce. To learn more or to invite Elise to speak to your organization, please visit her at elisecortez.com. Let's talk about how to get your employees working on purpose. This is Working on Purpose with Dr. Elise Cortez. To reach our program today or to open a conversation with Elise, send an email to Elise, A-L-I-S-E, at elisecortez.com. Now, back to Working on Purpose.
Thanks for staying with us and welcome back to Working on Purpose. I'm your host, Dr. Elise Cortez. As you know by now, this program is dedicated to empowering and inspiring you along your journey to realize more of your potential. If you want to learn more about how we can work together and learn about the Gusto Now Academy for leaders and individuals across various journeys alike, make your way to gusto-now.com and then navigate to the training tab and you can find the Academy and the content there. If you are just now joining us, my guest is Melissa Swift. She's the author of Work Here Now, Think Like a Human and Build a Powerhouse Workplace. Sounds good to me. Okay, so let's talk about this idea. This sounds, again, so simple and so eloquent, but if you could actually do this, what a game changer it would be. And that is, you have this notion of decisions about people for people.
Yeah, it's interesting. I wrote this chapter because people kept, like everyone around me kept talking about human-centric decisions, and I couldn't find anything about how to do it. So it's one of those things, if I can't find, how to do it, I'll figure out how to do it. And it's interesting because really making human-centric decisions a lot of times comes back into kind of super operational, practical reality, right? So just, thinking about, if I make this decision this way, what are kind of some of the scenarios that might result? What are the actual human impacts? Is this decision sustainable? Is this something that human beings are going to be able to do in 3 or 4 years? Does this decision consider people as actual humans? So, I'll give you an example that's interesting because it's a really neutral one. So a lot of the work that I've done has been global. Well, when you are trying to work globally, time zones are not your friend. I had one boss at one point from New Zealand who educated me and the entire team at great length about how hard it was to work from New Zealand, right? And how they had calls scheduled at 4 a.m, et cetera, et cetera. And, a lot of times organizations will just say, well, we're working globally and, you're going to be on the phone at 2 a.m. or et cetera, et cetera. Well, it doesn't consider the sort of profound impact of sleep for human beings. And that doesn't mean you can't ever schedule the call at 2 a.m., but maybe it means for that particular country, the call can rotate around. So it's 2 a.m. for New Zealand this week, it's 2 a.m. for the US this week, things like that, where, once I say it, you're like, well, God, what organization would do it any other way, Melissa? And the answer is all of them. We make all of these kind of silly boneheaded moves because we're just not thinking about, kind of basic human stuff. Like when we killed lunch, I actually talk about this in the book that I'm working on right now. When we killed lunch and suddenly we've got all these people acting weird in early afternoon meetings. Well, you know what? They're hangry.
Right.
Basic human basics around eating, around sleep, all of those things. Just bring it back into the equation and then think through kind of operationally these decisions that you're making. Can they really play out in real time in the long run without humans having to kind of stretch to fill the gap, right? Okay, we're gonna develop the software on an accelerated timeline. Well, okay, if you don't have the technological tools that strictly speaking enable you to do that, right, then it's just humans staying up all night and probably producing an inferior product at the end of the day, right? It's a good example of what's going to stretch in any system. It's going to be the humans.
Well, and then what I would say to that, of course, for the practice that we serve for organizations is, well, now you have totally discounted that this person is attached to anything else in their life but you, the employer. They don't need sleep. They don't need to eat. They don't have a family that they might actually want to see and engage with. They don't actually need to go out and exercise. They don't need to go out and buy groceries. They just need to hang out with you. And of course, I've had guests on before who talk about what a tremendous disservice that is to this one human being, the quality of their life, and the extent to which they could ever realize their potential. And of course, I have a problem with that.
Yeah, absolutely. And then at the end of the day, even if, I always say this, even if you don't care about the person as a person, which you should, even if you don't, taking away, to your point, all of that other meaning in their life, are they going to really do their best for you? No, they're not. They're not. Right. So it's lose-lose, right? You're not getting the best of that person, and that person isn't getting the best of their life. It's vicious cycle where it could be virtuous circle.
Yeah. So that brings me to just one of the strategies that you put forth here, number 34. I love that they all have numbers too and very crisp names, and it's related to what we're talking about here. So it's this idea of make humanism an acceptable part of corporate discourse. In other words, make it possible to be able to have this kind of conversation inside your organization.
Yeah, and it's interesting when you try to speak this way, how quickly people will sometimes slap your hand. I mean, I've been in a few of those conversations in the last, let's say, 3 weeks, where someone was like, oh no, Melissa, but ROI, but stakeholders, but no. We cannot have a business discourse that does not allow for the human beings that actually create organizations. I mean, it's interesting. That's where the name of my company actually comes from, is until 2008, biologists saw biomes and humans separately. So it would be like the tundra, and people live in the tundra. And an anthrome was them acknowledging that when people live in an environment, they change it so fundamentally that the name should change. And I love that, because that's like people. There's no people and organizations, right? It's one anthrome, and that's how we've got to be thinking about it. And then we're like, I don't understand why productivity doesn't increase. Well, because you couldn't understand what your organization was literally made of.
I love the thought behind the name of your company. I appreciate that when there really is thought to it. Ours is Gusto now because we believe in gusto, and I speak Spanish and Portuguese, and I got the benefit of being in those cultures. They taught me about the power and the enlivening agent of passion and connection and relational experience, etc. So I really appreciate that. Yours also has a strong thought behind it. Okay, there's so much more we could talk about, but I would be remiss if I didn't have you talk about your chapter on the intentional workforce combating the Great Resignation by managing workforce populations more thoughtfully. Given that, one of my books is called, The Great Revitalization, which is about combating the Great Resignation. So let's talk about what's going on there. What do you want to surface around that theme?
So I think the baseline data itself is super interesting. And again, this gets to a lot of the thematics that you touch in your work, that at any given time, and this baseline has been the same across kind of a crazy long period of time, about 28% of any given organization is thinking about quitting. And that's, to your point 2 seconds ago about the role of passion, right? That's almost a third of your workforce that's like, you know what? My passion's gone, right?
Mm-hmm.
I am about 2 seconds from being out the door. And then the interesting thing is that percentage varies by different, demographic groups. So, depending on what, piece of the population you're from, you may be even more alienated than that. Or, and that to me is a fascinating concept, because the Great Resignation, I think, again, it was one of those like water coming out of the lagoon moments that shows the rocks. I think it highlighted how there is this sort of long run, slow burn, and again, a lot of us see it in our work, engagement crisis.
It really is. Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Melissa. Please,
and just also that your mileage may vary. I think that's the other piece, is that if you're the leadership of an organization and you come from one of the demographic groups where the problems are not as pronounced, you're like, okay, everything's fine, sunny skies, happy days. And you don't necessarily, until somebody kind of shows you the data, say, well, look, X% of your coworkers from Y group are thinking about quitting every day. Like that's something to combat.
Right. And if they're thinking about that, we already know it's going to detract from their focus on their productivity and their actual work. If that's what they're thinking about, right, that's where their thoughts are. That's where the energy is. So there are 3 groups that you identified in your book that I think are really important for us to talk about, so that our listeners and viewers can start to consider how many of these groups they might have this impact in their organization. And you talk about how these 3 categories are deeply dissatisfied and potentially looking for other jobs all the time. So one of them is groups who have experienced demographically based discrimination. Can you talk a bit about what that means?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. This one really came to life for me, not even so much from the data. The data was already pretty bad, but when I went out and did some interviews, and folks started speaking about, once you've experienced you've taken enough kind of slaps across the face in terms of just feeling like you've not been treated fairly. At that point, it's like your whole tie to work it just loosens. And so they said, you might need a raise of X% to lure away my other coworker who hasn't experienced what I've experienced, but it only has to be half of that for me, because I'm just not as closely tied to this organization. And it's interesting because it transcends the actual organization. It might be that you haven't actually been necessarily discriminated against at the particular company that you're at that moment. It's just that the experience of discrimination kind of builds up in your psyche, and you don't bond to organizations in the same way, which is a perfectly rational response. That's what makes it kind of heartbreaking is, I see that and I kind of go, yeah, I get it. I get it that you wouldn't, at a certain point, you just wouldn't invest in any employer. You wouldn't give your heart and soul in the same way. And that's sort of, it's sort of super sad, and it's worth thinking about, because a lot of times people will say, well, we're a good company, we don't discriminate. But that's not the part that matters. It's that individual's experience over their lifetime that they are bringing into that job. And that's what you have to think about.
Right. And I certainly look at, that one precious life. This is somebody's precious child who deserves dignity, love, and respect, and is not feeling that. So it's related, of course, to the concepts of inclusivity, or not feeling like you belong, or feeling passed over, or that nobody sees me, and all these sort of things. So we say discrimination, and sometimes people are like, oh, no way, we don't do that.
We don't do that, right.
But it shows up so many other in other very slight ways that you maybe are just not at all aware of, but they certainly are. So I think your word heartbreaking is exactly the right word to use. Okay, so another group that you talk about that is deeply dissatisfied and potentially looking for other work are groups who are more loosely tied to their employers by virtue of life cycle or role. Say more about that.
Yeah, so this is the other interesting thing is, again, we're employing people in more diverse ways. And, and also you go through different permutations and combinations of different kinds of jobs within the organization. You might be at a point in your life where your life, to your point about there's all this other stuff in your life. You might be at a point where your life's just a little bit less about work. And again, we kind of apply this very flat lens of engagement to folks sometimes. We're like, well, the bad people are less engaged. Well, no, I think that this insight is all about there are a lot of good reasons why you might not have that close tie to your employer at that exact moment. But at the same time, it's a watch out for the employer. I think you see some of it with like, for instance, RTO mandates.
Yes.
Really hitting, let's say, women with kids. And it was a group that was, again, already not totally feeling it. And then you hit them with that, and that was it. And people are going, wow, they just quit? Yeah.
When broke the camel's back, yeah.
Absolutely. When the thread is already frayed, it doesn't take a lot for it to snap. And I think that's how we kind of have to think about these groups. But, also, again, some of these little things about little nuances, if your contractors all wear different badges in the cafeteria, even little things like that, again, you can't fault them for having a different relationship to the organization.
Right. So briefly, because we're coming out of time here, but the last group really quick that you talk about that really are feeling dissatisfied and potentially looking for other jobs are groups and industries with long-standing structural issues that flared during the pandemic. Can you briefly speak to that? And then we're going to talk about maybe one strategy we can maybe address here.
Yeah, well, if you're in retail, healthcare, any of these things where kind of the model of really serving customers properly in a way that also works for employees has had a ton of friction, you're in one of those industries, right? You are at risk. I mean, if I'm a hospital, I should be thinking about all my nurses in that category, just as a for instance.
Right. And just, we know how expensive it is to replace people, to train them and such. And then there's, of course, what they have to say to other people when they leave your organization. So just one strategy that you talk about to be able to address this issue here is figure out which employee groups are burnt out and which ones are fed up, and design differentiated strategies to address each of these issues. It's probably really obvious to you if you just start looking at this. If you could just say a little bit about this strategy.
Absolutely. Well, some of it is that you have to kind of engage with the concept of fed upness. And fed upness is there's a structural problem. So, oh, goodness, our software engineers keep quitting. Well, what is it about how you design software engineering jobs? What is it about how you manage software engineers, right? You see these little data pockets, right? Then you've got to say, okay, it's not, burnout is already bad, but this might be fed up. This might be structural, and I might need to make structural choices differently.
Melissa, this has been amazing. It's gone by so incredibly fast, but I want to give you the chance. This show is listened to by people around the world. Many of them are tuning in because they want to become better leaders themselves. They want to run their organizations in a better fashion, or they're just trying to learn how to be able to experience work in a better way for themselves. What would you like to leave them with?
Yeah, I would say I come back to the point that we started with. Honestly, the everyday experience of work. I think the closer you can get to the everyday experience of work, that's where the real insights lie. So just keep pressing on that simple thing.
That is a fantastic, crisp way to close. Melissa, I'm really delighted to know you. I learned a lot in your book. That's part of why I keep hosting the show. And then I meet amazing humans like you. So thank you for coming on Working on Purpose.
Well, thank you for having me. Frankly, I feel the same way. I feel so excited to have connected with you and the work you're doing, and I was really honored to be on.
I'm so glad. Thank you. Listeners and viewers, you are going to want to learn more about this amazing human, Melissa Swift, the work she's doing at Anthrome Insight, and her new book, Work Here Now. So there's a couple ways you can find her. One is by visiting her website. It's anthromeinsight.com. Let me spell that for you. So Anthrome is ANTHROME, and then Insight. INSIGHT. So anthromeinsight.com, or find her on LinkedIn. Last week, if you missed the live show, you can always catch it via recorded podcast. We were on air with Prithviraj Chowdhury talking about his book, The World is Your Office, How Work from Anywhere Boosts Talent, Productivity, and Innovation. Next week, we'll be on the air with Rich Davini talking about his book, Masters of Uncertainty, the Navy SEAL way to turn stress into success for you and your team. See you then, and together, let's lean in and learn together how to make workplaces that work for everyone and find ways to do business that in a way that betters the world. Let's work on purpose.
We hope you've enjoyed this week's program. Be sure to tune into Working on Purpose, featuring your host, Dr. Elise Cortez, each week on W4CY. Together, we'll create a world where business operates conscientiously, leadership inspires impassioned performance, and employees are fulfilled in work that provides the meaning and purpose they crave. See you there. Let's work on purpose.